She was eating a sandwich when Counselor Veth Aaron first noticed her. Not because of what she was doing, because of what surrounded her. The cafeteria of Relay Station Orvith 9 held 217 seats, arranged in the interlocking hexagonal clusters favored by Kalari social architecture. Every seat angled inward, every cluster designed so that no individual was ever more than 1.2 body lengths from another being. The Kalari had built the station this way on purpose. Isolation in their culture was not a condition, it was a diagnosis. The human woman sat at the center of an empty cluster, not at the edge, not in a corner where the geometry naturally thinned. At the center, where the seating arrangement made her solitude almost architecturally impossible, where the chairs around her would have had to be physically moved to create the gap she occupied. And they had been. 4 chairs, repositioned with deliberate precision, forming a ring of absence around her. Veth Aaron stood in the entrance corridor and watched her eat. She did not look lonely. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. She read from a small paper book, actual paper, which Veth Aaron had only seen in the station's Cultural Artifacts Archive, and she turned pages with the patient rhythm of someone who had nowhere else to be and no wish to be there. Her food disappeared methodically. She chewed. She read. She did not look at the clusters around her, where beings of 11 different species laughed and argued and performed the complicated social choreography that made communal eating a Kalari cornerstone of civilization. She looked like someone who had made a decision. Veth Aaron pulled up her personnel file on the walk back to his office. Lieutenant Commander Mara Voss, human, age 34, Xenolinguistics Specialist, Secondary Translation Division. Performance reviews, exceptional across every metric for 6 consecutive years. Social integration assessments, blank, not failed, not scored. Blank, as if whoever administered the assessment had simply stopped partway through and never returned to it. He flagged the anomaly and moved on to his afternoon briefing. He would not think about her again for 11 days. The second time he noticed her, he was frightened. The Kalari Interstellar Cooperative had been observing humanity for 43 years before they made formal contact, which was 22 years longer than their standard pre-contact observation window. The extension had not been a compliment. It had been a disagreement. Half the cooperative's observation council believed humans were ready. Technologically primitive by galactic standards, yes, still dependent on fossil combustion for 40% of their planetary energy grid when the Kalari found them, but possessed of the structural prerequisites for civilized integration: language, law, institutional memory, trade economies, rudimentary empathy protocols evidenced by their welfare systems. The other half of the council believed humans were something else entirely. They self-terminate, Counselor Irisal had said, 17 years before Mara Voss was born, in a session that was still referenced in cooperative diplomatic training materials. Not in moments of pain, not as a last resort. They self-terminate in the presence of each other. They build systems specifically designed to identify and prevent this behavior, and then the behavior continues anyway. Something in their neurology is not corrected by civilization. It is only managed. The council had voted to extend observation. What none of them had recorded, what no instrument had flagged, because it did not look like data, was that in the 43 years of watching humanity's broadcasts, learning humanity's languages, cataloging humanity's history, one cooperative linguist had developed a habit of watching a specific repeating segment of a human television program for reasons she could not fully explain. The program was a comedy series. The segment lasted 42 seconds. In it, a character sat alone at a table in a high school cafeteria, and the camera held on her face for an uncomfortable 3 seconds longer than comedic timing required. And then another character sat down across from her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And then the second character opened a lunch container, and the first character looked up from her food, and something moved across her face that the cooperative linguist had no word for. The linguist had flagged the segment as culturally significant. No one had known what to do with that flag. The file had been archived. And 17 years later, Mara Voss had been assigned to Relay Station Orvith 9 and had begun eating lunch alone, and not a single person who processed her assignment had thought to cross-reference the archive. Veth Aaron saw her the second time because he was looking for something else. A supply discrepancy in Storage Bay 11 had pulled him through a maintenance corridor he rarely used, one that passed behind the station's secondary observation deck, a curved stretch of reinforced transparent aluminum overlooking the cargo processing floor below. He was reading from a handheld datapad as he walked, not particularly watching where his feet took him, and he almost passed the entire corridor without slowing. She was sitting on the floor, not on a bench, not in a chair. On the floor of the observation deck, back against the wall beneath the window, knees drawn up, the paper book balanced on her legs. She was not reading. She was looking at the cargo processing floor below, where a crew of 8 Kelari dockworkers were guiding a massive atmospheric condenser unit through the articulated arms of the loading system. And the work was loud and complicated, and demanded all 8 workers in a constant state of adjustment, calling to each other in short coordinated bursts of Kelari motion language that layered sound and physical gesture into a single unified communication. She was watching them like someone watching a river. Veth Aaron stopped walking. He had learned in 22 years of diplomatic liaison work to be precise about what he observed rather than what he concluded. What he observed was a human woman sitting alone in a non-designated rest area in an unusual physical posture, watching a work crew she had no professional connection to. What he was resisting concluding was that she looked like someone memorizing something. He almost walked on. Then she spoke, and he realized she wasn't alone. "They shift the anchor call when the load exceeds a certain weight," she said without turning around. "Did you notice? Below a half-ton it's 2 syllables, above it 3. The third syllable is a warning, but it's so integrated into the rhythm that it doesn't sound like a warning. It sounds like the same call, just longer." There was a pause. Veth Aaron realized several seconds too late that she was speaking to him. Yes," he said. Because she was right, and because he hadn't noticed, and that second fact unsettled him more than he expected. "It's beautiful," she said, not wistfully, not sadly. The way a person says something that is simply, factually true. He looked at her file again that evening. The blank social integration assessments looked different now. He couldn't explain why. The station's population had questions about the human contingent, and they were not polite questions. Veth Aaron heard them in briefing rooms and maintenance corridors and mess queues, the way he always heard things, not because people spoke freely around him, but because people forgot he was there with a frequency that had shaped his entire career. The small one submitted a formal request to be removed from the shared habitat rotation. She asked for a single unit. They approved it. Administration said her productivity metrics justified accommodation. But Ren Sol in Habitat Management says she's the third human to make the same request. Is that normal for them? I don't know what's normal for them. Veth Aaron, standing at the end of the mess queue with his meal tray and his careful habit of being overlooked, thought, "That's the right question, and I'm not sure anyone here knows how to answer it." The human contingent on Orvith 9 was small, 11 individuals, assigned across various specialized divisions, the result of humanity's recent provisional admission to the Cooperative's Translation and Xenocultural Exchange Program. They were technically the first humans to serve aboard a joint species station. Every interaction with them was, in the language of the diplomatic briefings, an ongoing first contact. In the language of the maintenance corridors, they were strange in ways that no one had a protocol for. One of them had cried during a zero-G calibration exercise. Not from pain, the medical scan found no injury. When asked, he had said, "It just felt like flying." The Kelari medical officer who filed the report had flagged it as a potential psychological instability, because in Kelari neurological literature, unprompted tears were classified as a stress response. She had included a note at the bottom of the file, almost as an afterthought. Subject appeared calmer after the episode, not more distressed. Mechanism unclear. Another had given away her emergency ration allocation to a Thelian crew member who had expressed, once in passing, that the standard cooperative rations tasted nothing like home. She had spent 2 weeks synthesizing an approximation from available materials, had delivered it without announcement, and had refused any reciprocation. The Thelian crew member had reported the incident to station security because no species in cooperative records gave resources away without establishing an obligation, and she had assumed it was a trap. And then there was Mara Voss, eating lunch alone every day in the center of a ring of repositioned chairs, reading a paper book, looking like a decision. The misunderstanding began, as most catastrophic misunderstandings do, with someone trying to help. Station psychologist Orev Neen had been monitoring the human contingent's behavioral profiles since their arrival, and she had filed 3 separate concern reports about Mara Voss, each one more careful and more troubled than the last. The concerns were not about performance. They were about the pattern. Consistent social isolation, Orev Neen said. In the case review meeting, Veth Aaron had been assigned to observe. Self-selected removal from communal spaces. No documented social bonds with any crew member of any species, including other humans. Effective presentation is stable. She doesn't display distress markers, but the absence of distress markers in the context of severe social isolation can itself be a marker. Can be, said Administrator Save Thek, or it can be a species difference. We don't know enough about human social baselines to distinguish the two. That's precisely the problem. So what do you recommend? Orev Neen folded her hands in the Kelari gesture of careful consideration. I recommend we create conditions for connection, structured social integration, assign her to a collaborative project with a small team, give her a context where connection can occur naturally. Veth Aaron, sitting against the wall in his role as silent diplomatic observer, thought of the cargo floor, the way she had watched the dockworkers, the way she had said it's beautiful like it cost her nothing. He did not say anything because he was not sure what he would have said. The committee approved the recommendation. What happened next surprised everyone, including, he suspected, Mara Voss. They assigned her to the Vithrak Cultural Documentation Project. 3 other specialists, a Kelari archivist named Sel Ori, a Thelian acoustic analyst named Ferris, and a Dewar engineer named Kask, who communicated primarily through subsonic frequency patterns and required a translation relay to interact with most of the team, were already 6 months into the project when Mara arrived. Sel Ori filed a report on the first day. The human specialist joined our morning alignment session and did not speak for 47 minutes. When she did speak, she identified an error in our phonemic mapping of Vithrak's secondary register that Ferris and I had spent 3 weeks developing. She was correct. She offered no explanation for how she identified it. When I asked, she said she had been listening. The report concluded with a line that Veth Aaron read 3 times. I am uncertain whether to flag this as an asset or a concern. The second report came 4 days later. The human specialist has begun arriving before the rest of the team each morning. I found her yesterday sitting with the raw audio files playing through her personal relay unit, not taking notes, simply listening. When I asked what she was doing, she said, I'm trying to hear what I'm not supposed to notice yet. I do not know what that means. Neither, I believe, does she. She said it the way humans sometimes say things, as if the words are finding the shape of a thought that hasn't finished forming. Ferris added an addendum to that report in Thelian acoustic notation that translated roughly as, she hears the spaces between sounds. I have not met anyone else who does this. And then, on the 9th day, something happened that none of them reported for a very specific reason. They were reviewing a particularly difficult segment of Vithrak's ceremonial recording, a passage that the entire xenolinguistics community had classified as either ritual noise or a degraded recording artifact, because no structural pattern could be extracted from it. Ferris had run it through 17 different analytical frameworks. Kask had applied 3 Dewar engineering models that treated sound as architectural structure. Sel Ori had cross-referenced it against every Vithrak cultural document in the cooperative's archive. Mara had listened to it twice. It's a conversation, she said, silence, between 2 people who have never talked before, she continued. One of them is saying something that doesn't have words yet. The other one is listening to the part that doesn't have words. She paused. I think it's what they do when someone is new, when someone doesn't fit yet and doesn't know how to say that. Ferris said very quietly, "How do you know?" And Mara looked at her paper book, which was sitting closed on the corner of the table, and she said, "I've heard it before." No one filed a report on that exchange. Not because they forgot, because they all understood, simultaneously and without discussion, that filing a report would require them to explain what they had felt in that moment, and none of them had the language for it. This was the thing the cooperative had missed. Not in the 43 years of observation. Not in the psychological profiles and social integration assessments and behavioral reports. Not in the diplomatic briefings or the species compatibility matrices or the cultural sensitivity training modules developed by specialists who had never spent 9 days sitting with a human woman and a set of untranslatable audio files. What they had missed was recorded, 18 years earlier. In the archive no one had cross-referenced. In the flag no one had known what to do with. A 42-second television segment, a character sitting alone, a second character sitting down, and something moving across a face that no one had a word for. The cooperative had classified human social isolation as a pathology. They had not considered the possibility that some humans had learned to carry silence differently, not as an absence but as a kind of listening. That the ones who ate alone were sometimes the ones who heard the most. That the distance wasn't damage, it was calibration. And they had absolutely not considered what happened when someone sat down anyway. It was Cask who sat down, not metaphorically. Literally, the doer engineer reconfigured their translation relay to function without the standard 15-centimeter minimum range, moved their workstation to the seat directly across from Mara's, and began working there every day without comment or explanation. Doer did not explain social choices. They made them. Mara looked up from her paper book when Cask first moved. She looked back down. She did not move her chairs. But the next morning, when Cell Ori arrived, there were 2 chairs at the central table instead of 1, Mara's and Cask's, and the remaining chairs from around the room had been redistributed to the workstation areas, as if someone had been reorganizing for efficiency. As if the ring of absence had been quietly, deliberately, reduced by 1. Orevnine received a summary report 3 weeks later and concluded that the social integration intervention had been successful. She noted that Mara Voss had demonstrated measurable increase in social engagement metrics and closed the file with a recommendation that the approach be replicated for future human assignees. She had no idea what she was measuring. She had no idea that Mara Voss had, by that point, begun teaching herself doer subsonic frequency patterns using nothing but a modified audio relay and a set of handwritten notes in a paper notebook. Not because anyone had asked her to, not because the project required it, but because Cask had moved their chair and she was trying to find a way to say thank you in a language that didn't have a word for it. She had no idea what Mara had discovered in the process. The doer had a frequency that no translation system rendered correctly. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a grammatical unit. It sat in the subsonic register below conscious speech, a low continuous pulse that doer emitted only in the presence of beings they had decided to trust, a biological marker, involuntary, like a heartbeat. The cooperative's translation systems had been filtering it out for decades as background noise. Mara had noticed it in the raw audio files 2 weeks before she told anyone. She had spent those 2 weeks cross-referencing it against every session recording, every interaction log, every archived doer communication in the project's database, building a map of when the frequency appeared and when it didn't. The pattern, when she finally had enough data to see it, made her put down her paper book and sit very still for a long moment. The frequency was present in every recording of Cask interacting with the team, but it was not consistent. It was strongest in the sessions where something went wrong, where the work hit an obstacle, where the team disagreed, where the translation failed and they all sat with the failure together rather than dispersing. In those moments, Cask's subsonic frequency increased in intensity, not distress, not withdrawal, The opposite. Cask, Mara said one afternoon, speaking into the translation relay. I need to ask you something, and I need you to know I'm not asking because I found a problem. I'm asking because I found something I don't know how to interpret. The relay rendered Cask's response as a series of short tonal pulses that it translated as, proceed. When the work is hard, Mara said carefully, when we don't know the answer and we're all sitting with not knowing, is that when you feel most? She paused, searching. Most present, a long silence. Then Cask said something that the translation relay rendered incorrectly, because the relay was filtering out the subsonic register, but Mara heard it anyway. She heard it the way she heard the spaces between sounds, and she wrote it down in her paper notebook, in her own approximation of doer frequency notation, and underlined it twice. What the relay rendered was, proximity to others who do not leave is the definition of safe ground. What Mara heard underneath and between was something with no translation at all. She began crying, not from sadness. Cask's frequency spiked. Sel Ori, walking in from the archive corridor, stopped in the doorway and looked at both of them and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then, what did I miss? Everything, Mara said. And also nothing, we're fine. Sel Ori decided not to pursue it, because she had been on enough difficult projects to recognize when a team had arrived somewhere real. Veth Aaron found out about the doer frequency discovery 3 days before the team published it, because Sel Ori sent him a draft of the findings with a note that said, I think you need to read this before the council does. Not because it's dangerous, because it will change what they think they know, and they need to be prepared for that. He read it twice. He read the attached session transcripts 4 times. He sat in his office for a while with the lights at half intensity, a Kelari habit for serious thinking, and he thought about a woman eating a sandwich in the center of an empty cluster of chairs, about a television program in an archive, about a second character sitting down, about something moving across a face. The doer frequency finding was, objectively, a significant xenolinguistic discovery. It would change how the cooperative's translation systems process doer communication. It would require re-analysis of decades of archived doer interaction records. The implications for interspecies diplomacy were substantial. The cooperative had been conducting negotiations with doer communities for 30 years, without knowing that their interpreters had been filtering out the signal that told them whether the doer trusted them. 30 years of negotiations. An entire body of diplomatic relationships, built without a key piece of information. But that was not the part that held Veth Aaron in his chair with the lights dimmed. The part that held him was the methodology section of the report. Specifically the line that read, Discovery arose from researchers' informal observation of subsonic data, conducted outside of designated analysis hours, using personal equipment modified without station authorization, motivated by an attempt to communicate gratitude in a non-standard frequency. She had broken 3 station protocols to find a way to say thank you, and in doing so, had uncovered something that 30 years of formal diplomatic methodology had missed. He thought of Orev Neen's integration report, measurable increase in social engagement metrics. He thought of the assessment methodology that had generated the word blank where Mara Voss's social profile should have been. He thought of the cooperative standing position on human social isolation, pathology, possible instability, mechanism unclear. Something in his understanding shifted. Not corrected, not fully corrected, because correction implied he had known the right question to ask. Shifted, the way a translation shifts when you realize the word you've been rendering as silence actually means the act of waiting for something worth saying. He called an emergency session of the station's Diplomatic Liaison Committee. The social integration intervention for Lieutenant Commander Voss, he said, when the committee had assembled, did not succeed for the reasons we believed. Administrator Save Thek looked up from her datapad. The metrics indicate. The metrics measured what we expected to see, Veth Aaron said. We expected social connection to improve her function. We found evidence of social connection and concluded we were right. He pulled up the frequency findings. We were not right. We were looking at the correct outcome and misunderstanding the mechanism entirely. Orevnine leaned forward. Explain. She was not isolated because she was failing to connect. She was isolated because she was listening. The isolation was preparatory. He put down the datapad. She was doing something we do not have a framework for, and we intervened to stop it, and she connected anyway. And in connecting, she found something we have spent 30 years missing, because she was trying to communicate in a language that our translation systems had classified as background noise. The room was quiet. I want to revisit every social assessment filed on a human crew member since the exchange program began, Veth Aaron said. Everyone marked blank, everyone flagged for isolation, everyone where our methodology produced a gap instead of an answer. That's 47 files, Save Thek said. I know. What do you expect to find? Veth Aaron thought of Ferris's addendum, rendered in acoustic notation. She hears the spaces between sounds. He thought of Cask's frequency spiking when Mara cried. He thought of a ring of repositioned chairs and a ring reduced by one, and what it meant that she had let it be reduced. I don't know, he said. That's the point. The 47 files took 6 weeks to review. What they found was not a pathology. It was a pattern distributed across 11 humans, expressed differently in each of them, but structurally identical when you knew what to look for. The humans who had been flagged for social isolation were not failing to integrate. They were integrating differently, on timelines that did not match Kalari's social architecture, through mechanisms that did not register in cooperative behavioral metrics, leaving traces that the assessment systems had recorded as absence rather than presence. The human who had cried during 0G calibration had, by the time of that review, become the person every member of the doer engineering crew sought out when a calculation was failing. Not because he was better at engineering, because he asked questions that assumed he was missing something, and that assumption created a kind of openness that apparently doer engineers found useful in ways their own team culture didn't naturally produce. The human who had given away her ration allocation had generated something in the Thelian crew member that the Thelian crew member could not name and had never reported, because the Thelian species did not have a protocol for reporting unrequested kindness. She had started, quietly, arriving 5 minutes early to crew briefings and saving a seat. She did not know she was doing it. When a researcher noticed and asked her about it, she said, with evident confusion, I always do that for people who might be late. Who told you she might be late? Nobody. I don't know. It felt right. Orevnine read that transcript 4 times in a row. She had spent her career measuring social behavior. She had developed the assessment frameworks used across 11 stations. She had trained 43 junior psychologists in the cooperative standard integration methodology. She did not know what she was looking at. She called Mara Voss's quarters directly, something station psychologists did not typically do outside of formal session scheduling. It was early morning station time. Mara answered after one chime, fully awake, her paper book visible in the background. I have a question, Orevnine said. Okay. When you eat alone, when you chose to eat alone, when you moved those chairs, were you? She stopped, started again. Was there a point to it? Were you doing something? A pause, not evasive, considering. I was getting quiet enough to hear properly, Mara said. It's hard to explain. When there's too much social pressure, I spend most of my attention on managing it, on being what people need me to be in the moment, and I lose track of, she stopped, reached for the paper book without opening it. I lose track of what I actually notice, what I actually think. The quiet is where I find out what I'm actually paying attention to. And the chairs, moving them specifically to the center of the cluster, not to the edges. Another pause, longer, because I didn't want to disappear, Mara said very quietly. I wanted to be alone, not invisible. There's a difference. Orevnine sat with that for a moment. Our assessment systems registered your isolation as an absence of social data, she said. I know. They weren't measuring the right thing. No, Mara said. And then, because she was Mara Voss, they were measuring whether I was doing what you expected. They weren't measuring what I was actually doing. She paused. Nobody asked. The line was not accusatory. It was simply factually true, in the same way that it's beautiful was simply factually true. Orevnine closed the session and sat in her office for a long time with the lights low. The council received the full review report on a Tuesday station time. By Thursday, 3 separate working groups had been convened, 2 existing assessment frameworks had been suspended pending revision, and Veth Aaron had been asked to prepare a diplomatic briefing on the implications for the cooperative's broader human integration policy. He worked on the briefing for 4 days. He submitted it on the 5th. The council's response came back in 9 hours, which was faster than most council responses by a significant margin. The response contained 12 procedural questions, a request for supplementary data, and 1 line at the very end that was not a question, was not procedural, and had clearly been written by someone who had read the briefing closely enough to feel something they hadn't expected to feel. If the human's isolation was not pathology but methodology, if what we interpreted as disconnection was in fact a specific kind of attention, then we are forced to ask, how many other signals have we been filtering out as background noise? Veth Aaron read that line. He read it again. He thought, yes, that is exactly the right question, and I don't think any of us are ready for the answer. The project published its findings 8 months after Mara Voss joined the team. The Dewar frequency paper alone generated more citations in its first year than any xenolinguistics paper in the previous decade. The secondary paper, the one about the assessment methodology, co-authored by Orev Nin and Veth Aaron, was more quietly influential, but in the rooms where policy was made, it was the one that people kept returning to. It had a section near the end that several council members later said they found themselves thinking about at unexpected moments, the way you think about something that hasn't finished resolving. The section described, in careful academic language, the methodological implications of evaluating a species' social behavior using frameworks built entirely from other species' social norms. It described the concept of measurement tools that could only detect the things they had been built to detect, and the specific blindness that created. It described with considerable precision the way that the cooperative's assessment systems had looked at Mara Voss and produced the word blank where her social data should have been, not because there was nothing there, but because the systems could not read it. It did not describe what Kask had said when Mara found the frequency and understood what it meant. That part hadn't made it into the paper. Mara had written it in her notebook instead. On the morning the paper was published, Veth Aaron walked through the cafeteria on his way to the diplomatic wing. Old habit now. He had started taking this route months ago without entirely deciding to. Mara was at the central cluster. The chairs around her were still repositioned in their precise ring, but the ring now held 4 people. Sel Ori, eating something bright orange that smelled improbably good, reading through the final publication draft. Ferris running audio through a small handheld relay, head tilted in her listening posture. Kask, workstation configured in the space beside Mara's, emitting, Veth Aaron could hear it now that he knew to listen for it, a low continuous pulse just below the range of conscious perception. And Mara with her paper book which was closed. She was not reading. She was looking at the others with an expression that Veth Aaron had never learned a Kalari word for, but which he thought he might finally have learned a human word for. Not happiness exactly. Not relief. Something that lived between them. The expression of someone who had waited a long time and stayed anyway and had been found there waiting and had not been asked to explain why they'd stayed. He kept walking. He did not stop because there was nothing to interrupt. What was happening at that table was complete without his observation, had been complete before he arrived, would be complete after he left. He was not part of it, and that was not a loss. It was, he was beginning to understand, a different kind of data. The kind that meant, this is not yours to measure. It is only yours to recognize. At his desk, he opened a new document. He had not planned to write anything that morning. But the line had been sitting in him for months, the way findings sometimes did, waiting for the form that could hold them. He wrote, the cooperative's error was not that we observed incorrectly. It was that we observed without asking whether our instruments were adequate to the thing we were trying to see. We looked at a species that had learned to carry silence as preparation and called it absence. We looked at a species that chose isolation as a form of listening and called it damage. We built systems to detect their social behavior, and the systems returned blank, and we believed the blank. The blank was never empty. We were simply not listening at the right frequency. He sat back. Outside his window, the station moved through the slow rotation of its orbital cycle, the cargo floor below active and loud with the calls of the dock crew, the layered complexity of Kelari motion language rising and falling in its ancient rhythm. 2 syllables under a half-ton, 3 above it. The warning built into the call itself, so integrated you couldn't hear the warning without hearing the whole. He thought of a 42-second television program, a character sitting alone, a second character sitting down, the camera holding 3 seconds longer than it needed to, something moving across a face. He finally knew the word for it. It wasn't relief, though there was relief in it. It wasn't happiness, though there was happiness too. It was the expression of someone who had begun to believe that the space they occupied in the world might be permanent, might be real, might not require constant renegotiation, who had, in a single moment of someone sitting down without being asked, received the only information that had actually mattered. I can see you, and I'm not leaving. 30 years of diplomatic frameworks, 47 blank assessments, decades of archived doer negotiations missing a key frequency. And at the center of all of it, a woman eating a sandwich alone every day in a ring of repositioned chairs, reading a paper book, waiting. Not to be rescued, not to be fixed, not to be integrated, to be heard at the right frequency. The cooperative would spend years revising its methodology. It would redesign its assessment instruments, rebuild its translation filters, reopen 30 years of doer diplomatic records. It would produce papers and working groups and revised protocols, and several very long, very serious conversations about the nature of measurement, and the difference between absence and silence, and the particular kind of damage done by instruments too certain of their own precision. And in all of those years, and all of those papers, the thing that no one quite found the language for, the thing that lived at the bottom of the doer frequency data, in the margin of Cell Ori's report, in the subsonic pulse that spiked when Mara cried, in the 42-second television program in the archive, no one had known what to do with was this: that the most important transmissions are not the ones that fit your instruments. That some signals spend years in the frequency range your systems have labeled noise. That the ones who sit alone in the center rather than the edge are not absent from the world. They are waiting, very precisely, for someone who knows how to listen. And when that someone arrives, when they move their chair without explanation, when they save a seat without being asked, when they sit down across from you and open a lunch container, and neither of you says anything for a moment, something passes between you that no assessment system on record has ever successfully measured. But everyone who has ever felt it knows exactly what it is. The station rotated. The cargo floor called out its warnings in integrated rhythm. Somewhere in the xenolinguistics wing, a paper book sat closed on a table, and the space around it held 4 chairs instead of 1, and something that had been accumulating for a very long time continued, quietly, to be.